It's a great pleasure for us to be here at the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution. Thank you for coming in
Not
Russia.
at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
So what is your vision in general, in brief, of the Russian Revolution? How do you consider it as an event in the Russian history?
Well, obviously that's an enormous question. What I tried to talk about yesterday when I was on the panel was merely the international context, which I think was very important. And it has all sorts of ramifications, both as to why the revolution happened, why the Bolsheviks succeeded in hanging on to power, and what the consequences were. Certainly when you're trying to teach or explain the Russian Revolution in the West, it is very difficult, because of the nature of Western academics and the way their own sympathies take them. It's very difficult to explain that there were actually very good reasons to fear what would happen if Russia made a separate peace with Germany. In the event the worst fears did not happen, Germany did not win the First World War because of American intervention, basically. But nevertheless, Russia did suffer very much indeed from the fact that Russian power had been extinguished in 1917 and that Russia played no part in the peace conference or in the settlement. I mean, the great irony there was that the First World War, more than anything else, began in Eastern Europe as a struggle between the Germanic empires and Russia for the predominant role in that area. The great irony was that a war which had begun in that way ended with the defeat of the Russians, the Germans and the Austrians. And therefore the peace settlement is made against Germany and Russia and without Germany and Russia. And of course, since Germany and Russia are potentially the two most powerful countries in Europe, not at all surprisingly, that peace settlement was extremely unstable and unlikely to last. If Russia had been one of the victor powers, if, as would then have happened, the peace settlement did reflect Russian interests to an extent, and Russia felt committed to it, if, as would certainly have happened, the Franco-Russian alliance had survived, then you would have had a viable military support for a stable European peace settlement. Instead of which, what you have is a huge vacuum in Eastern Europe, a Versailles order to which neither Germany nor Russia is committed, and the near impossibility for communist Soviet Russia and liberal capitalist Britain and France to agree together to oppose the rise of Hitler. So, I mean, unfortunately, one of the great tragedies for the Russian people, and this is partly because of the revolution, is that the 2 million Russians who died in the First World War died for nothing. The interwar period was
and nobody remembered them,
Yeah, no one even remembered them, exactly, until very recently. Thank God someone, at last, the government does, recognise their sacrifice. But worst of all, Russia had to fight the First World War twice. And of course, the second time, in 1941-5, was utterly devastating. So there is, there's tragedy everywhere one looks. And it has also to be said that, very, very few Russians, whatever their political persuasion, in 1900 or in 1908 or 9, would have desired the situation in which Russia was in the mid-1930s. And that again has all sorts of reasons why things have evolved in that direction. I think personally that the Leninist idea almost inevitably led to dictatorship, though not necessarily to the terror of the 1930s and collectivization. But it is also the case that the international context, the war, out of the war coming a civil war, all of these problems, then the international context of the 1930s and the ever-growing danger of another conflict and of Soviet Russia's isolation as the only socialist state, all of these, of course, made a bad situation vastly worse and did contribute undoubtedly to the radicalization and huge destructiveness of Russian domestic politics.
Let's discuss the nature of the First World War, because not many, but at least some historians here in Russia think it was a kind of irony that Russia fought the Entente side, the British and French side in the First World War, because traditionally we had more or less privileged relations with Germany, some better or worse bad relations with Austria-Hungary, and then
Yep.
everything was changed in a decade, in a less of a decade. So what do you think about it? Was it natural or irrational, such alliance of Russia and
Look, you can
Entente?
understand the reasons why the Franco-Russian alliance was signed and why the Russo-German traditional friendship increasingly disappeared. This was a question of balance of power. It was a question, certainly for the Slavophile tendency, of conflict with Austria in the Balkans. It was, in a sense, an attempt to ally with France so that the two second-tier powers on the continent, Russia and France, should not be pushed around by what was then potentially the most powerful state in Europe, undoubtedly Germany and its Austrian ally. So you can see the logic of it. It fitted into the logic of international relations and balance of power thinking at the time. But it was a disaster. It was a disaster for the Russian people and it was a disaster for the German people. What is it? About 45% of all Russian trade was with Germany in 1913. The two empires had an immense interest in each other's stability and prosperity. If you think in geopolitical terms, the great interest for Russia was to preserve peace and to get on with the development both of its own domestic society in general and, of course, of Siberia in particular. Those who within the Russian elite who argued that if only Russia was given the time to develop its possessions in Asia, it would undoubtedly be the most powerful state in Europe and the only European country with any possibility of competing with the United States in the long run. And I think they were right.
Yeah.
And I think, the beginnings of a sort of Eurasian ideology underpinning that were very interesting. And it is to the point that Eurasian ideology had none of the bitterness, none of the anti-Western aspect that, came after the revolution, initially originating in the white emigration. And of course, it seems to me that the single greatest reason for the war was the crisis of empire in Eastern Europe. That, above all, meant the growing decline and potential fall of the Ottoman Empire and increasing worries about the long-term prospects of the Austrian Empire. And actually, the only way that the many very difficult issues which the crisis of empire, created, the only way that could be resolved peacefully was through Russian-German collaboration. And actually, it could have been solved peacefully, I think. The issues involved did not entail absolutely fundamental opposite interests of Germany and Russia. There was room for compromise if the situation had been better understood. And I think there was fault on both sides, undoubtedly. I have no doubt that in July 1914 it was the Germans who were responsible for starting the war. But if you look back further and ask for the reasons why the two empires, the two peoples, if you like, had diverged, then I think you can see fault on both sides. And I do think that, for a very long time now, the Russian-German relationship has been the most important in Europe, and I think it still is. And I think it is very important for both sides that relationship should not be sacrificed to issues which, to my mind, are of secondary importance.
In this framework, in this logic, what do you think about the role of our last emperor, Nicholas II? You know that now there is huge debate, more than on revolution. We discuss about our last Tsar, about his Matilda, and very other things. So,
well, of course,
putting back Matilda Krzeszynska. So, what is Nicholas' role in the war and in the revolution?
Well, of course, we knew Nicholas and my family, and we also knew Krzeszynska quite well. We have some letters of her somewhere, because in France,
she stayed there,
and my grandmother and my aunt were there, and they tried to help her during the war. Look, it is almost impossible to be the head of state and head of government of a very complicated government machine in an immense empire in the 20th century, with all the enormous expansion of the role of government. Very, very difficult to be that for life. before one says anything about Nicholas II's personal characteristics or his successes or failures, as essentially chief executive officer of the government, I think you have to reckon on the fact that the job he was asked to do actually is beyond human power. So that's a start. I don't think he was, of course, when he came to the throne, he was totally inexperienced.
That's true.
I don't think he was nearly as stupid as is usually said in the West. He was in an immensely difficult situation and a very contradictory one. And to put it at its simplest, in one ear he had advisors telling him, and with good reason I think, that given the potential agrarian crisis in Russia and the fact that you did not yet have solidly rooted private property accepted in the mentality of the Russian peasantry, you had a potential class war in the cities, where the Russian working class, for all sorts of reasons, is among the most radical in Europe. You had an empire less than half of which was Russian, and you had a revolutionary movement which was completely irreconcilable and would certainly exploit any weakening of the state, any liberalization in the cause of radical revolution. People like Pyotr Nikolaevich Donovo, the minister who crushed the 1905 revolution, who told Nicholas II that until you had created a large middle class and a large, stable peasant landowning class in Russia, if you dismantled the police state, there would be complete social revolution. I mean, they had a point. They were not stupid. And Donovo's memorandum to Nicholas II in February 1914 is, I think, the most intelligent document I read during my study of that era. But the unfortunate emperor has in his other ear what you might describe as the more liberal end of the ruling elite. And they say to him, look, it may be the case that only 18% of our population is urban and, if you like, European. But 18% of an empire of this sort is a bigger modern society than in almost any other European country. You cannot hope to run such a modern society, you know, with newspapers, with circulations of the hundreds of thousands. It's a very sophisticated society. This is, you know, already almost postmodern, long before the West, you know, painters like Stravinsky, everything. You cannot hope to run such a society by what is essentially an 18th century would-be enlightened despotism. You just can't. And if you try and run it that way, you will alienate more and more of the Russian elite, and your dynasty will lose all support and will collapse. And the trouble is that they were right as well. So the poor emperor has flatly contradictory advice coming in from both ears. The advice in both cases, I think, has got a great deal to be said for him. And therefore his room for manoeuvre is extremely narrow. He fights hard to try and maintain some kind of balance between the authoritarian state and listening to society. And they might have pulled through. But the war, for which he really can't take responsibility, he was not responsible for the outbreak of war in July 14, August 14, the war just puts the whole system under such immense strain that, you know, it breaks up. So, of course, he made mistakes. I mean, the biggest mistake he made was the onset of the Russo-Japanese War. More than in anything else, that was his decision. And it was not that he wanted the war, but the policy he pursued was incautious and failed really to take on board the fact that even if you defeated Japan, you would still have weakened Russia, because you would have been hugely vulnerable in the Far East whenever there was a European crisis. The Japanese would have waited their opportunity to take their revenge. The defeat against Japan, of course, had catastrophic consequences. Again, you know, one can understand his basic position. Consolidating Russia's hold on the Pacific Ocean was extremely important. There were very good reasons to fear Japanese power in Korea and Manchuria. After all, if the Japanese had gone north and not south in 1941, we'd all be living in a different world. You know, so it's not that what he is doing is absurd. It's the tactics and the miscalculations and the way he disorganized the government, you know, in that period by appointing Alexeyev as viceroy. I mean, these are details, but there clearly he made it, and he knew he'd made a mistake. He realized he was, you know, he was the chief culprit in many ways, and that helps to explain why he ran foreign policy quite differently from 1905 to 14. Never again did he try and go behind his foreign minister's back or run a sort of independent policy. But in general, how can one do anything but feel pity for a man who, after all, didn't choose his role? This was something with which he was lumbered. He felt it was his responsibility. He felt, perfectly fairly in the circumstances that he had a responsibility before God and also a responsibility to protect the Russian people. He absolutely, sincerely believed that he was the protector and friend of a still, semi-literate mass population, and their best guide and protector through all the very difficult problems of modernization, defense, and preserving the unity of the empire. And after all, in the last resort, he could not have suffered more himself. There are few worse fates than having your children murdered in front of you.
Yeah. Yesterday we had a special session about the October Revolution and its impact on the Russian and the global development. And surprisingly, many people, many participants started with their personal histories, with their personal biographies connected to the revolutionary events. So maybe may I ask you to share with our audience your personal story, because
this, of course, is the story of my grandparents' generation, which, in a way, was remarkable and not really what one would have expected given the background. These were big landowners, Svetleshi Knyazya, and indeed, my great uncle Anatol performed exactly the role in the revolution and the civil war that you might have expected. He commanded the first squadron of the Chevalier Guard. He then commanded a brigade in Yudenich's army, was wounded, and actually died on his estate in Latvia in 1937.
Lieven, in fact, is of Kurlandish
origin. They were almost certainly from the indigenous Liv people who were there really before anyone, before the Latvians, let alone the Germans. My grandfather, his younger brother, rather counterintuitively, his life was saved in the revolution by the local Jewish community. He had a big estate in northern Latvia, Livonia, and it included at least one or two little towns, one of them not so little. And the local Latvian population, which of course by September 1917 was very radicalized, decided to kill him, locked him up in the barn, and we're going to shoot him the next morning. And I've had all this described to me by my uncle and aunt, who were children at the time, were locked in the nursery. And the local Russian regiment was a Siberian unit, but the men had drunk too much. The officers tried to rescue him, but the men were not against him. They just were not capable of doing anything. So everything looked as if it was going to be a disaster until about 2 in the morning. My uncle and aunt remember that they heard this extraordinary noise coming up. The manor house was on top of a hill. And it was the local Jewish community who stormed the hill, essentially, led by their rabbi, scared the Latvians into letting my grandfather go and saved his life. Because, he was a decent, gentle character. And before the revolution, he'd built hospitals and orphanages and all other these kind of welfare institutions, and had insisted that the Jews had equal rights of access. And since he built churches for the Christian population, he supported the building of synagogues for the Jews. And he always said afterwards that of all the people he'd been generous to, before 1914, probably it was the Jews who most fully responded to his generosity. So it was a very interesting story. And decades later, I remember in London, he remained a firm friend of the family, the grandson, or possibly great-nephew, I've forgotten, of the man who owned and ran the big store on the estate, who in that part of the world almost inevitably was Jewish. And his grandson, or great-nephew, had become really a very famous doctor in London. It was his surgery that the first Israeli-Jordanian peace negotiations happened, because both Golda Meir and King Hussein of Jordan were his patients, and everybody trusted and liked Manny. And listening to Manny, I got just yet another strange set of counterintuitive insights into, that period. And my grandfather got his exit visa through Krasim, who'd long since been a friend. wanted my grandfather to stay because my grandfather had trained as a railway engineer. He was not interested in being a landowner. He was allowed to, pursue his fascination for technology until he got married, at which point he had to go back and sit on his estates and, pretend to run them. And my grandfather told Krasin, my grandfather was waiting in the queue in the Smolny. And Krasin asked him why he wanted an exit visa. And my grandfather said, look, my wife and children have gone, I can't stay. So Krasin said, splendid, most things have changed to the good in this country, but not everything. You don't need to stand in a queue. They went off to have lunch together. After lunch, Krasin came back, went round the back, got my grandfather an exit visa. And my grandfather, Kammerjunker, Svietleshi Knyaz, and son of the Oberceremoniemeister, was escorted to the Finland station in emigration by Krasin, and a bodyguard of Red Guards. So, I remember the Krasin family afterwards. So some of these personal stories are interesting and not at all what the official, general line would make you, expect.
That's true, because the Krasin family was not of, let's say, proletarian origin, yeah?
They were not, and indeed, not merely was Krasin not.
It was a paradox that he joined the revolution.
Yes, but then, I remember my great-aunt, Grafinia Palin, telling me about how older members of her family used to meet with Chicherin at Rapallo, but they used to meet on the fire escape of his hotel because neither side wanted to be seen meeting the other. So there are many, many personal stories, which of course added to the fascination of my childhood. There were a lot of reminiscences of this sort.
Okay, we can discuss further and further, but our time is limited. Thank you very much, Professor Lieven, for the interview, and let's hope that your research about Russian Revolution, about Russian history will continue, and you'll publish very interesting new books.
If I was allowed to add something, the Russian translation of my last book comes out this week by Ross Penn.
So everybody to the bookshop.
It's possible to buy it, and to give it to your grandmother.
Yeah, thank you.
Not at all.
Thank you.